Hi everyone, welcome to Apex Hours. Today I'm going to be talking about demystifying code for admins, the last step to Apex. If you haven't seen Apex Hours before, it's hosted by Amit Chaudhary. So thank you to Amit for hosting. He's active on the Salesforce developer community. Definitely check out his blog. He also organizes the Farmington Hills Salesforce developer user group. He is the founder of Apex Hours, and definitely check him out on Twitter at AmitSFDC or at Apex Hours. For me personally, my name is Adam Olshansky. I'm a Salesforce MVP and Salesforce architect at Google. I have a bunch of Trailhead badges and 16 certifications, and definitely would love for you to follow me as well on Twitter, Adam17AMO. You can also check out my blog, adamtoarchitect.com. And if you're looking to potentially pass the Platform Developer 1 certification, I have some Pluralsight courses that might be able to help you out. I'd recommend you check out a free trial for 10 days at bit.ly/AO free trial. All right, I'm very excited to be back here at Apex Hours and talking about demystifying code for admins. So my expectations for the talk today, I do want you to be kind of, as an admin, thinking about concepts that you already use and know how to do in declarative development. I'm going to show you some small blocks of code, and I do want you to try to understand what the small blocks of code are doing, even if you don't necessarily understand every little punctuation mark, right? Don't worry as much about the code syntax, but try to understand what the code itself is doing, right? I will try to walk through some of the syntax as we go along, though. I don't want anyone, leaving this this video thinking they're going to be able to know how to code within 40 minutes. But what I do want is that you can get in the process of beginning to understand code within 40 minutes. So hopefully you'll be able to get to that point. All right, so let's really quick start with why we're here. I'm a big believer that if you can understand code and you can do a good Google search, you can begin the process of writing code. Just understanding code, even if you don't get to the writing part, can already bring a ton of value to your company, right? You'll be able to interact better with developers and potentially take your company's projects to the next level. It'll also increase your own personal job and career opportunities, though, right? Maybe you can stand out on your resume if you can share that you know a little bit of code, you can understand a little bit of code, or even you can add more value by communicating with the developers and giving them a head start to solving problems as well, if you could figure out kind of where the problems are originating from on the code side. All right, for the talk here today, I have a couple things I want to go over. We're going to start off just talking about kind of what is code and what is Apex. From there, I'm going to do a brief review of admin tools and concepts, right? Things you already know how to do as an awesome admin. After that, I'm going to get into the Apex building blocks, right? We're going to start talking about Apex code and what is needed to build it. We're going to put all those Apex building blocks together and actually look at some Apex examples, and you'll see some sample code put together as well. And then lastly, as with most talks, we will wrap things up, talk about summary and next steps. All right, so my hypothesis for this talk is that you're already developers, you just may not know it yet. And we'll see if by the end of the talk, you agree with me. And may see Cody back there. I think he believes in you too. All right, so we're going to start off with kind of what is code. And I promise it's not as scary as you think. At the end of the day, this is really all code is. It's ones and zeros. It's computer language. Right now, I don't know about you. I do not speak in ones and zeros, unfortunately. And fortunately, most other humans don't speak in ones and zeros either. And so over time, they've developed compilers, also known as translators, to take what we're writing on the code side, or maybe the configuration side, declarative Salesforce, things like that, to translate it or compile it into ones and zeros. You actually may be familiar with this process already if you've ever written a Salesforce formula. You click that, check syntax button. That's Salesforce trying to turn the formula you wrote into ones and zeros that it can understand. Right, and over time, we've gotten a little bit better about this, right? When humans first started coding, we had to physically punch holes in cards and feed it into a machine, right? The hole punches were the ones, and the non-hole punches were the zeros. And eventually we said, all right, that's kind of too hard. We don't want to do that anymore. Let's make it a little bit easier. And we got to the point where we could kind of specify a value, but we still had to tell the computer, hey, here's exactly where in memory you need to store it. And that was a little too complicated, so we got into writing logic commands with languages like C. And we really started focusing on that logic and tried to make it a little bit more readable with things like Java and Apex. And eventually Salesforce got to the point and they said, hey, you don't, for a lot of things, need to write code anymore. You can just use point and click tools, declarative development, to do everything you need to do. And we'll turn it into code behind the scenes. So you're probably already actually coding, even if you didn't know it. And so for the most part, as awesome admins, you've been living here in the Salesforce config world. And I'm going to take you one step closer to the ones and zeros and start living in the Apex world. Right? I talked about this compiler being kind of like a translator. And if you've ever tried translating a language, or if you've ever played the game of telephone, right, you might realize that the farther and farther away you get from the source, the more things tend to get lost in translation. And that's no different with code, right? The farther you get away from the ones and zeros, the more things can potentially get lost in translation. And that's why you might hear that with code, you can do more things than you can declaratively, because you are a little bit closer to the ones and zeros, and you can speak the computer's language a little bit better. All right. So with that in mind, understanding code, let's do a quick review here of admin tools, right? And when I say admin tools, right, these are all the tools Cloudy loves, right? Objects, fields, reports, formulas, workflow rules, process builder, and flow. Workflow and process, obviously, are probably going away pretty soon if they haven't already, but you've probably used them before, or at least seen them and have an understanding of how they work. And so I'm going to talk about them a little bit here today. But for the most part, all of these things you've probably seen and used before. And again, I want you to focus on really the concepts behind each of these tools. Right, so let's start off by talking about objects and fields, right? You're familiar with this concept of creating a field, right? You have to specify what data type it's going to be, right? And after that, you have to give it a name. And you might have noticed when you create a field and you create an object, after you give it a label, this name or this API name is going to be auto-populated. And generally, the API name is just going to be, replace the spaces with underscores and add underscore C to the end. And in code, this is what we care about. And you'll also probably see this turn up in your formula fields as well. But this is what we're going to be using on the coding side. So you can change the label all you want, so it'll look different to the users in the UI, but the API name is what we care about in the code. Spaces and code tend to not play together very well, and so that's why we replace them with underscores. And the underscore C just means that it's custom. So if I look at the API name for the account object, for example, it's just going to be account. But here we see I have a job application, custom object, and an applicant name, custom field, with some underscore C's after them. All right, you're also probably familiar with reports, right? And if you think about the concept of a report, we're basically querying for some records based on some condition. And when you create a report, right, the report builder is going to ask you what type of report you want to create. What objects do you want to report on? What objects do you want to get some records for? And after you specify the objects you want, you'll specify the fields that you want, the columns, right? What fields do I want to show up in my report? And then you'll also potentially put filters in, right? Limit. You don't need all of your account records, for example. Maybe you just want your account records where the type is customer direct or customer channel. So this concept of getting records based on some condition, you're probably familiar with as well. All right, let's talk about formulas for a minute here. So you might have seen these in school, you've probably used them in Salesforce, but if you think about the kind of concept behind a formula, it's this idea of we're going to take some input that we know, we're going to put it into a black box, and we're going to output some value that we have then calculated. And formulas are going to look something like this, right? We're going to take some value we know, today's date, we're going to add 5 to it, and we're going to get a date 5 days from now. All right, let's go back to that kind of theme of the job application I mentioned before and talk about a potential approval required checkbox formula field, right? And like we saw with fields, also for formulas, you also have to specify the data type ahead of time. I'm going to update this formula a little bit to make it a little more readable and a little more code friendly. So instead of this and function, I'm going to replace it with a double ampersand. And that's what we use in code as well to mean and. And so my formula says if the years of experience is greater than 5 and the department on the parent job is IT, approval required should be true, otherwise it should be false, right? And again, we see the API names in our formula here, but basically we're taking 2 field values we know, doing some calculation, and we're getting a true or false as a result. All right, let's look at a little bit more of a complex formula. And I might have a formula that looks like this, where I can chain logic together and pass output kind of up the hierarchy. So I might start with a date time submitted field, right? I'm filming this December 18th. it should say 2022, 10:15 a.m. I'm filming it a little bit later than 10:15 a.m. But let's say somebody submitted their job application this morning, December 18th, 2022, 10:15 a.m. So that's my date time submitted on my job application. And behind the scenes, right, it might look like 12/18/22, 10:15 a.m. But behind the scenes, we're going to see this long string here where we have the year, the month, the day, the letter T, and then the hour, minutes, seconds, and milliseconds. And we're going to take that value, we're going to pass it up to our time value function, and we're just going to drop the date and get 10:15 a.m. And we're going to take that 10:15, we're going to pass that up to the hour function, and we're going to get the number 10. We're then going to take the number 10, pass it up to a text function, and get the text value of 10. And so if you think about it, I started with an input, December 18th, 2022, 10:15 a.m., and I ended up with the text 10. That's what my hour of application formula field calculated for me. All right, I think the last formula we're going to look at is this concept of multiple conditions with some sort of fallback. Right, so I might have a formula that says, all right, if the amount field of my opportunity is greater than $1 million, set the priority to high. If that's not true, let's go down to the next condition and say, okay, now, if the amount is greater than $100,000, let's set the priority to medium. If none of our conditions are true, that's fine. We'll set the priority to low. And this is similar to how case assignment rules work as well, where we'll have different conditions, we'll check in order, and we'll have a fallback at the end. All right, let's talk about workflow rules for a minute. Again, you're probably not building any more, but you may have built them before, or you may at least have an understanding of how they work. And the concept behind a workflow rule, all of the declarative automation is pretty similar. You need to give the automation a name, you need to specify the object the automation is going to run on, and you have to specify when it's going to run. Right? For workflow, it's going to be when it's created, when records are created or updated, or when it's created or edited to meet criteria. So we're going to choose an object and when our automation is going to fire. Right? And then in workflow, we can specify different criteria, we can specify some filter logic, and then we'll end up taking some action. Right? And our action might be something like, okay, we want to update a field. Process builder, similar thing, right? We give it a name, we choose an object, we choose when it'll fire, and we can specify a little bit more, complex conditions maybe. We want to set some specific conditions when it's going to fire, and we can take additional actions than we could in a workflow rule. And we can build out these complex processes, right? We can drag and drop things around. We can specify if we should keep going, we should stop. We can execute multiple actions at once, right? And really build out complex processes within our process builder. And then, of course, we get to flow. So I'm going to specifically focus on record-triggered flows here. And the concept behind a record-triggered flow, right? When we specify it, once again, we're going to end up choosing what object it's going to fire on. We're going to specify when it should fire, right? When records are created, updated, or deleted. And we're also going to specify what we should optimize the flow for. So we're going to optimize it for either fast field updates or actions of related records. And if you look at this closely, the fast field updates are going to fire before the record is actually saved to the database. So before we even save it while we're saving it, let's just quickly update some fields, right? That's why it's called fast field updates. Once the record has been saved to the database, after, we'll have the ID of that record for sure, and then we can take some action on it, right? Sending an email, updating a field on a related record, things like that. But with flows, we have this option of configuring, do we want our logic to fire before a record is saved or after a record is saved? Another thing we can do with flows is keep track of variables, right? So I can specify a variable, I can choose the data type, I can allow multiple values and specify that it should be a collection variable, right? And I can store these values and use them later on in my flow. Right? If I have a collection variable, I can also loop through it, right? Maybe I have a list of names I want to loop through one at a time and do something with them all. We also have this concept of specifying if values in our flow should be available for input or available for output, right? Maybe we want to pass a value to our flow from a Lightning component. Maybe we want to send a value from our flow to a Lightning app builder page, right? We might have different values that we want available to other things that are going to be talking to our flow. And with flow, there's a bunch of other logic we can do as well, right? We can have decisions where we go one direction or another direction. And again, we can do data operations, right? Create records, update records, delete records, get records, things like that. A lot of different things we can do in Flow that we can't do in the other automation tools, right? But you're probably familiar with a lot of this already. Okay. Now, why did I spend all this time going over stuff you already know? Well, I promise it'll be important here as we get into the Apex building blocks. And so now I'm going to convince you that everything you already know is just one step away from Apex. Or in other words, Apex is one step away from point and click. All right, so we talked about all this before, right? The key concepts we just went through a couple minutes ago, right? We talked about conditional logic. We saw it in our formulas, our if function. We saw the logic we can set up in workflow, process builder, and flow. And we also do this in Apex. And for conditional logic in Apex, we call them if statements, similar to how we do in formulas. We talked about this notion of creating variables, and we talked about before you create them, you have to specify what data type they're going to be. Same thing when you create fields. What type of data are you actually capturing here? And we do the same thing in Apex, and we call them variables, just like we do in Flow. We saw this option of chaining logic together, right? We saw it in formulas. We talked about that we can do it in Process Builder. We can do it in Flow. And we can also do it in Apex. And in Apex, these are called methods and classes, right? We're going to have different methods, and they can call each other, and they're going to exist in different classes. We talked about this notion of querying for records, right? We saw it in reports. We're going to put some conditions in place and get a bunch of records for an object. We saw there was a get records option in Flow. We can do there as well. And we can also query for records in Apex, and that is called SOQL, Salesforce Object Query Language. Very similar to SQL if you've ever used SQL before. We also talked about this concept of choosing an object and an action to fire on. Right? We saw it in workflow, process builder, flow, right? You're going to choose the object the automation should fire on and when exactly it should be fired. And we do that in Apex too, and we call them Apex triggers. We talked about this idea of looping over collections, right? I put an example in there of what it looks like in Flow. We can also do it in Process Builder. And of course, we can also do it in Apex. And those are going to be our for loops. For each record in a list, do something to it. And lastly, we talked about this idea of manipulating records, also known as S-object records, Salesforce object records, right? Whenever we want to change records, whether it's in a workflow, a process builder, a flow, or even in Apex, we can do it using some sort of automation. And in Apex, when we want to manipulate records, we need to use something called DML, or database manipulation language. So if there's one takeaway from this talk, I want it to be this. All of the concepts you already know how to do on the declarative side are the exact same concepts that you use in Apex. All right, now I'm going to go ahead and prove it to you. All right, so we saw this formula already, right? Conditional logic, right? I'm going to take out this text here and swap out what this looks like in Apex. So similar to what we have on the left side of the screen in our formula, we have on the right side in Apex. And you might notice a couple maybe weird things here, but first in line 1, we see our if statement. When we're looking at a formula field, it already has the context of a record. It's the record that the field is on, right? So we know this priority field is going to be referring to the opportunities amount field that it's on. In our code, we just have to tell it what opportunity we're working with. So we're going to work with some opportunity called opportunity. And we're going to say if that opportunity's amount field is greater than 1 million, set the priority on that opportunity to high. Again, note the API name here. We also see another keyword in line 4, else. Else basically just means, okay, check the next condition, right? So if one condition is true, set the priority to high. Else, if the amount is greater than 100,000, set the priority to medium. So just like in our formula, if the first condition is not true, now we'll check the next condition. And then in line 7, we have our final else with no if. Else, none of the above conditions are true. We have our fallback, set the priority to low, just like we do in our formula field. Right, same thing on the left and right. Looks a little bit different, but you already know how it works. All right, we talked about this, right? This idea of creating variables with the data type and assign a value, and then we can reference it later. And we can also do this in Apex. And when I create variables in Apex, it's going to look something like this. And just like in our flow or in a field, whenever we create a variable in Apex, we have to do two things. We have to tell Salesforce what type of data it's going to be, and we have to give it a name, and then we can assign it a value. So if we look at our code here, line 1, we see a red boxed word, integer. Integer just means number, right? If you think back to school grade math, you might be familiar with integers. Integer is just a number. So we have a number. We gave it a name, myInt. We can name it whatever we want. Ideally, a name that is useful and is going to tell us what it is. So we have an integer called myInt, and we're going to set it equal to the value of 10. And then we see a semicolon, which is basically the end of a statement in Apex. So we have an integer called myInt equals 10. That's a variable. In line 2, we're going to have another variable. This is going to be of type string. String is just text, right? A string of characters. So we have a text value called myString, and we set it equal to the value Harry Potter is awesome, which I think it is at least. And we see Harry Potter is awesome is in single quotes, but the entire Harry Potter is awesome string is assigned to our myString variable. Line 3, we can also create SObject variables. So we have a variable of type account, and we assign it a name of my account, my ACCT. And we give it a value of a new empty account, right? We can add some fields to it later. Line 4 gets a little more interesting. We see this keyword list. And if you remember back in our flow, we had that checkbox to make a variable a collection so it could hold multiple things in it. This is basically the same thing we would do in Apex, except instead of creating a single integer, we're going to create in line 4 a list of integers. So we could store more than one integer in the same variable. Right? Note that collections in Salesforce can only have a single data type. So we can have a list of integers, we can have a list of strings like we do in line 5, but it can only be one thing. So line 4, we have a list of integers called myIntList, and we're going to set it equal to the values 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, all stored in the myIntList variable. And then line 5, we have a list of strings called houses, and we're going to set it to a new list of strings containing the houses Gryffindor and Ravenclaw, again going back to our Harry Potter theme. All right. We've talked about formulas, right, where we have an input that we know, we put it in a black box, do some calculation, and we output some value as a result. And in Apex, again, we do the same thing. We take some parameters that we input, we put it into what's called a method, we do some calculation on it, and we spit out some value that we return at the end of it, right? Just like we do in a formula. And so if we go back to this formula I mentioned at the beginning, right, where we took a value we knew, today's date, added 5, got another date at the end, we're going to do something similar in Apex here. And so I'm going to jump around in this code a little bit. I'm going to start in line 5, actually. And I'm going to take some integer. I'm going to call it myInt, and I'm going to give it a value of 12. All right, just like we did before with our variables. So I have a value called myInt equal to 12, and I'm going to go to line 6 now, where I'm going to make a new integer called myNewInt. And instead of giving it a number like we do in line 5, I'm going to give it the value of add5myInt. What does add5myInt mean? So add5 is actually calling a method that we have defined in line 1. And myInt in the parentheses is going to be the input parameter we pass into that method. So let's go take a look at our method now. In line 1, we see that in a red box, we have the word integer. And that just tells us that our add5 method is going to return an integer at the end. Just like with our formulas, we have to specify what type of formula it's going to be, right? What type of field value are we going to have at the end of this? So in our deadline field, we're going to end up with a date. Same thing with Apex methods. We have to tell it, hey, at the end, whatever you do, I need an integer back from you. So if we keep looking at line 1 now, we see integer, we see add5, and then in parentheses, we see integer x. Which means, hey, when you are talking to the add5 method, for it to work, it needs some integer that it's going to call x. It can call it whatever it wants. But it needs some integer x, and it's going to give you an integer at the end. So if we go back to line 6 now, when we call add5, we pass in myInt, the value 12. 12 becomes this integer x in our add5 method. And then in line 2, we're going to return the value of x plus 5. So we see in the red box the word return, which means, hey, this is the end of our method. This is the value I'm giving back to you. We're returning x plus 5. And in line 6, we passed in the value 12 as our x. We're going to return x plus 5, so we're going to return 17. So if I ran lines 5 and 6 somewhere, and I had some code later on, and I wanted to reference myNewInt, the variable in line 6, we can be pretty confident it's going to be the value 17. Because that's what we calculated in our add5 method, similar to what we do in our formula. All right. Well, I updated forgot to update this formula, but we talked about the concept of this formula, right? Somebody submitted their job application this morning, December 18th, 2022, 10:15 a.m., and we put it into our formula, and we ended up with the text 10 at the end. And I'm going to do the same thing now with code. And so I'm going to, in line 1, we see our formula, we see our method defined in line 1. Let's start in line 10, though. And let me move my face out of the way. In line 10, we see a string variable called myHour, and it's going to be equal to get application submit hour application dot date time submitted. Okay, well, that's a mouthful. But get application submit hour is going to be defined in line 1, and we're passing in a date time that we call dt. Then we can call it whatever we want. Let's pretend we're passing in not the value on the screen, but the value that we talked about before, December 18th, 2022, 10:15 a.m. So I'm going to pass in this morning's job application date time as our dt. And just like we do in our formula up above, we're going to do the same thing in our method. So line 1, I see the box around the word string, which means, hey, I know you're getting a date time, but I need a string value. I need a text value when you're done with all your calculations. Just like we have in our formula, right? We started with the date time, we ended up with text in our hour of application formula field. So we start with the date time, and just like we do in our formula, we're going to pass it into various methods, various functions. And so line 3, we're going to start off by turning our date time into an integer. So we've declared a new integer variable called hour, and we're going to set it to dt.hour. So just like our formulas have an hour function, Apex also has an hour function on date time. So we can take our date time, turn it into the number 10. So now we have the number 10 in line 3. And just like our formula has a text function, similar thing in Apex, but it's string.valueof. Basically, whatever you have, give me the string, the text version of something. So we're going to pass in our hour variable from line 3, which remember is 10, into string.valueof in line 5, and we're going to assign it to that variable hour in text. So hour in text is going to be the text 10, just like in our formula field. All right, so we took a date time, we turn it into a number, we turn it into text. We're ready to return it now. Line 7, we can return our hour in text. And if the date time submitted was December 18th, 2022, 10:15 a.m., the result is correct. The myHour variable we defined in line 10, after going through the method calculation, would be the text 10. Right, and if we need to use that variable later on in our code, we know what the value is going to be. Okay. Move my face back down here. So we talked about this also, right? This notion of reports, right? When you're building a report, you're really just querying for a record, querying for records, right? You choose the object you want the records for, you choose the fields, the columns you need, and then you give it some filter criteria. And we're going to do the exact same thing now in Apex. In Apex, we call it Sockwell, though, but it's a pretty similar structure. We're going to use the word select. We're going to specify some fields we want, just like in our report. We're going to use the word from. We're going to specify the object we want the fields and the records from. So in our case, account. And we're going to have the word where, and then our filter, just like we do in our report. So just like in our report, we're going to get the name, type, and rating fields from account, where the type is customer direct or the type is customer channel. And if I go into any new dev org and run this Sockwell query, I'm going to get the same 11 accounts that I would if I ran a report with the same criteria. So if you ever see a Sockwell statement in your code somewhere, it's always going to have this format, right? Select some fields from some object where some condition is true. Right, but again, you're already familiar with this concept whenever you build a report. And if you've used SQL before, like I said, you might be familiar with this syntax as well. All right, we talked about this idea where we choose an object and when it should fire, right? We saw this with accounts, we saw this with process builder, we saw this with flow, right? When I'm building some sort of automation, I have to give the automation a name, I have to specify the object, and I have to choose when it's going to fire. And in Apex, again, we do the same thing, and those are going to be our Apex triggers. And so if you go into the setup menu in your org and search for Apex triggers, and you look at any trigger, they're all going to look something like this. right? They're going to have in line 1, or wherever the first line of actual code is, the word trigger. They're going to have the name of the trigger. It's going to tell you what object it is acting on. So in our case, on account. And it's going to have a bunch of events of when it's going to fire. And if you remember when we talked about flow, right, our record triggered flows can fire before a record is saved to the database or after a record is saved to the database. And same thing with our triggers. We can have our triggers fire before a record is saved or after a record is saved. And we can have it fire on various events. In our case, we're firing it on insert, update, and delete. We can fire it after undeletes as well if you bring something back from the recycle bin, and then also after insert, update, and delete. But every trigger is going to look something like this. The word trigger, the name of the trigger, on some object, and then our events. And so now you know when, assuming the trigger is active, when something happens to that object, what code is actually running, depending on the events. Right, I talked about this a little bit, right? This idea that we can loop over collections in our flow, and we can also loop over collections in our Apex. And those are going to be what are called for loops, right? And they're going to have the keyword for. So let's take a look at our loops here. So first code block in line 1, we have a list of opportunities called oplist, right? Again, so just like we can have a list of integers, a list of strings, we can have a list of opportunities. And I'm going to call some method somewhere called getOpportunities, pretend it does a SQL query, and gives me back a list of opportunities, right? In line 2, I can now have a for loop that says for each opportunity that I'm going to call O, and call whatever I want, each opportunity that I'm going to call O, in my op list from line 1, set the amount on that opportunity to 10,000. And this is going to loop through every single opportunity in my op list and set all of the amounts to 10,000. Let's look at our code block down below. Doing a little more calculation here now. I might have an integer, list of integers, rather, the same one we defined before called myIntList, and we're going to set it equal to the values 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, all in myIntList. And let's go add up those numbers now, right? You might see this in some code somewhere where we have to calculate a value based on something in a collection. So in line 2, I'm going to have an integer variable called total, and I'm going to set it equal to 0. And in line 3, I'm going to say, okay, for each integer I in my int list, let's add it to the total, right? Our new total, is going to be our previous total plus the current value of I that we see in line 4. So we're going to start our loop running. When the loop runs for the first time, I starts at the beginning. So I is going to be the value of 1. Our total is going to be 0 plus 1. So our total variable, line 4, is going to get updated to 1. All right, for loop keeps running now. I is equal to the next value. So I is equal to 2. Remember, our total was 1. We're going to add 2. And so now our total is going to be 3. Okay, for loop keeps running. We get to our next I. I is now 3. Our total was previously 3. We're going to add 3 more. We're going to get 6. We're going to go to the next I. We're going to add 4. Our total is going to change to 10. Our total is now 10. We go to the final I. We add 5. We get 15. And the for loop is smart enough to know, hey, I've gone through the entire list. I'm going to stop running now. And if I use my total variable here after line 5 in my code, I'm going to be pretty confident that my total variable is going to equal the value of 15, because that's what we just calculated. All right. And then lastly here, we talked about this before, this idea of manipulating S-object records, right? We did it in workflow, we did it in process builder, we can do it in flow. And of course, we can do it in Apex using, it's called DML, or database manipulation language. It's a pretty basic language, actually, though. I think there's only like 7 words in it. And it's going to look something like this. So line 1, we're going to create a new account variable called new account. We're going to set it to a new account whose name is Hogwarts. And in line 2, we see our first DML statement, insert new account. So I like to think of DML statements as buttons in the Salesforce UI, right? If I open up a new account record in the UI and I start entering fields, until I hit the save button, Salesforce is just going to ignore me. And DML works kind of the same way. I can change whatever fields I want on records, but until I fire that DML, Salesforce is going to ignore me. So if I go into a dev org and run these first 2 lines here, I'm going to end up with a new account whose name is Hogwarts, because I ran my DML to actually insert it into the database. Okay, let's say I have an opportunity in my org now called Westeros, right? Harkening back to Game of Thrones. So just like we saw before, a SQL query, right? I'm selecting some fields from some object where some condition is true. So I'm getting an opportunity whose account name is Westeros. And line 6, I'm going to change the amount on that opportunity to $1 million. Again, Salesforce doesn't care until I fire my DML, until I hit that save button. So line 7, that's my DML, that's my save button. But because the opportunity is already there, I can update the opportunity instead, right? Another DML statement. Let's say there was a mistake. Game of Thrones is done with. We don't want to be updating this opportunity anymore. We actually want to delete this opportunity altogether. Line 9, I can fire another DML statement to actually delete the opportunity from my org, just like I would if I hit the delete button in the Salesforce UI. Again, a concept you're probably already familiar with if you've worked with records before. Okay, so we walked through the Apex examples. Hopefully you're somewhat convinced they're similar to the concepts you already know. I'm going to try to put some of these together now for you into some actual concrete Apex examples. To start off, though, I want to talk about where Apex lives. So if you're looking in your org and say, okay, where is Apex? Apex is basically in two different places, right? You can think of Apex as just files, right? You might have a Word doc, a PDF on your computer. Same thing. Apex is going to be in trigger files and class files, right? Trigger files, as we saw from our trigger, it's going to fire as a result of some event, some database event, some record being inserted, updated, deleted, undeleted, right? That's what's going to fire your triggers. And so if you go into the setup menu in your org and you search for Apex triggers, you will see all the triggers there. You might also see them in VS Code or in the developer console as well. You will also find Apex code in classes. So basically anything that's not a trigger is probably going to be in a class. And again, classes are also just files. And classes can be called by a trigger. They can be called by other classes. They can be scheduled. And you can call them from declarative tools as well, right? You might be familiar with the concept of invocable methods you can call from a flow, for example. But that's where all your Apex is going to live. So I'm going to show you now a sample trigger and a sample class that calls. All right, so we're going to write a trigger together that's going to fire on some account events. And hopefully some of the concepts we just talked about will look a little bit familiar to you. All right, so first 4 lines of my trigger here. I'm going to create a new trigger whose name is account trigger on the account object. And I want this trigger to fire before accounts are inserted and before accounts are updated, right? So that's all line 1 is saying. Line 2 is a comment, just giving us some additional context. And now we get to line 3. Line 3, we're going to start off by creating a new list of accounts called new accounts. And we're going to assign it to a special trigger variable called trigger.new. And trigger.new is basically part of Salesforce. And basically, it's part of the trigger that will automatically hold the values that cause the trigger to fire. So in this case, my trigger is going to fire when accounts are inserted or updated. So if I go into Data Loader or any other tool and I insert 100 new accounts, update 100 new accounts, all of those accounts are going to be in a list called trigger.new, right? And this is going to represent all the new values of these accounts. If I wanted to compare to previous values, for the update scenario, I could find those values in trigger.old and then do a comparison between the two. For now, though, we're just going to take all the accounts that were either newly inserted or newly updated, and just to make it easier to read, assign it to a variable called new accounts. That's all line 3 is doing. And now in line 4, we're going to be working with some cases later, so I'm going to preemptively create a new list of cases called cases to insert. Again, probably telling us we're going to be inserting them at some point. And I'm just going to create a new empty list of cases for now, right? All right, so we have access to the accounts that fired our trigger, and we created a new empty list of cases. That's all we've done so far in our trigger. Okay, and now we're going to have a for loop in here. So we're going to loop through our accounts and set the rating based on the annual revenue. So line 6, we have our for loop, and we're saying for each account, ACCT, in new accounts, we're going to do a check. If the annual revenue on the account is greater than 500,000, set the rating to hot. If the annual revenue, right? So first check. Line 9, else, if our annual revenue is not greater than 500,000, let's see if it's greater than 100,000. If it's greater than 100,000, we'll still set our rating to warm. And then line 11, if none of our conditions are true, that's fine, we have our fallback. we'll set our rating to cold instead. Right, so for each account that was newly inserted or updated, we're going to set the rating based on the annual revenue. Okay. If we set our rating to cold, I'm going to go create a new case. Oftentimes you'll see this pattern of people trying to keep their triggers relatively clean. And so whenever you have to do some more complex processing, or any processing at all for that matter, you might send that off somewhere else to a different class, right? You might be familiar with this concept if you've looked into building subflows, where you don't want any one flow necessarily to get too messy. So you might build a subflow to do some of that logic for you. And then you could reuse it as well. So same sort of thing here, right? If our rating is going to be cold, we're going to create a new case. Just a heads up, you've inserted or updated a case that is now cold because the revenue is under 100,000. All right, so to do that, if you remember back when we were talking about methods and calculating values based on other values, we're going to do that here. So line 14, we're going to create a new case that's going to be the result of a method call. We're going to be looking at the account trigger handler class and a method called create case, right? Just like we have fields on objects using dot notation, we have methods and classes that use dot notation as well. So line 14 is saying, hey, I have a class called account trigger handler. We see the dot, and then we see the method name create case. And the create case, we're going to pass in as the input parameter the current ACCT we're looking at in our for loop from line 6. Right, so we have a create case method. It's going to take an account, and based on the code in line 14, we also see we're taking our account and we're going to end up creating a case. Okay, so let's go ahead and take a look at this class now to see how we're creating that case based on the account. Okay, so here we have our account trigger handler, our class in line 1, right? And in line 2, we see our create case method. In our create case method, we see is going to return a case, and as a parameter for input, take in an account called ACCT. That's what line 2 says. Method is called create case, takes an account, and returns a case. All right, so now let's go ahead and construct that case. Okay. Line 3, we're going to start with, we're just going to create a new empty case, right? Case called new case, new empty case. And we're going to start populating fields in this case, right? We're going to set the subject on the new case in line 4. We're going to set the account ID in line 6, the description in line 7, the status in line 8, the owner ID in line 9. And you'll also notice that we're using our ACCT variable to get some of these values. For example, our subject on our case in line 4 is going to be low revenue account and then the account name. Note that line 5 says if we're inserting accounts, there's not going to be any ID, but if we're updating accounts, the case will be tied to the parent account. All right, so line 6, the account ID on the case is going to be the ID of the account. Our description and status are always going to be the same, and the owner ID on the case is going to be the owner ID on the account. And then line 11, we're going to return that new case. So we took our account, we created our case. Now line 11, we're ready to return our new case back to the trigger that fired it. Right, so keeping this new case we just constructed in mind, right, line 11, we're returning it back to our trigger. Let's go back to our trigger now. We created our case using our account details. And now in line 15, we're going to take that new case we just created in our method, and we're going to put it in that variable we created in line 4, our cases to insert variable. So just like we have, right, lists with multiple things in it, same thing here. Again, list with multiple accounts. For every cold account, we're going to put a new case into our cases to insert list. And then after our for loop exits in line 18, we're going to have our DML to insert our cases to insert. So we took all of our cases, we put them in a list, and now we can insert them at once. We do it this way to, again, speed things up, right? DML tends to take a little while from a performance standpoint. We also have a limit in how many DML statements we can run in a single transaction. And so to make sure we're following the rules and making our code most efficient, we're just going to store them in a variable, And once we're all done with our calculation, we can insert them all at the end. And that's what we're doing here. All right. Again, don't worry if you weren't able to follow all of this. Feel free to go back and watch the video again. Go back to the previous concepts, refresh yourself on them. But hopefully this gives you a little bit of an idea of how to use some of the concepts we talked about in some working code. All right, now that we went through all that, let's wrap things up and talk about next steps and where you can show off your skills. All right, hopefully you're somewhat convinced now that declarative and programmatic code aren't actually that different. They're actually based on a lot of the same building blocks. Right, at the end of the day, code is just ones and zeros. It's computer language. And Salesforce makes it very easy to write code using point-and-click tools. Declarative tools that you already know how to use are based on various key concepts, and the concepts that we use in Apex are pretty much the same concepts you use in declarative tools as well. Right, and you can also combine these Apex building blocks together into triggers and classes. Right, I'm a big believer that if you understand how admin tools work, and you add some of the coding syntax, you can begin the process of understanding code. And of course, you can understand code and do a Google search. You can also begin the process of writing code on your own. And if you still don't feel like a developer yet, I promise you that you're almost there. All right, where to learn more, there's a ton of resources out there. For now, I'd recommend starting off on Trailhead. Here's a couple badges I'd recommend checking out. You got Apex Basics and Database, Apex Triggers, Apex Basics for admins, and the Quick Start Apex Coding for admins. My coworker at Google, David Liu, has a great website, sfdc99.com. I raised some Apex examples on there as well. I worked very closely with Kieran Jameson, one of the founders of Rad Women, which I'm a big proponent of. Check out Rad Women. But she has a blog, Women Code Heroes, with some Apex examples on it as well. I recently came across this new website, apexsandbox.io, some Apex examples you can check out and play around with. Of course, I have some courses on Platform Developer 1 on Pluralsight. David has some courses on Pluralsight. Dan Appleman, Don Robbins, a bunch of people with courses on Pluralsight, a lot of which can help you learn some Apex. So I definitely recommend checking that out as well. If you do want to get on Pluralsight and you don't have an account yet, again, 10-day free trial with that link at the bottom, bit.ly/AO free trial. Again, thank you so much for having me here at Apex Hours. Definitely let me and Amit know what you thought about the video using the hashtag Salesforce Apex Hours. Tag Apex Hours, tag me. Check out the Apex Hours site. Check out the Farmington, Michigan developer group, the Apex Hours YouTube channel, and my blog, adam2architect.com. Always love coming on Apex Hours, and hope to see you all again soon. Thank you.